Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at the 2020 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Competitive Advantage Talks, brought to you by Craft Analytics Group. My name is Lindsay Solitar, and I'm a first-year student here at MIT Sloan. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next presentation, Playing Catchup, estimating player and positional value in American football. Please join me in welcoming our next presenter, Paul Sabin, Senior Sports Analytics Specialist at ESPN, to the stage.
They weren't joking. These lights are pretty bright. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm happy to be here. They told me we don't have anything after this, so if you're happy for the next 3 hours, I'll talk your head off. At ESPN, that was a joke, by the way. At ESPN, we are all interested in telling stories, right? That's our job. We want to serve sports fans. We want to tell them great, interesting stories. And football is the most popular sport in America, and it has been for quite some time. But it has sufficiently lacked in all sorts of data and analysis beyond just a few positions, right? And we really want to be able to quantify how players can be valued and who is a good player, who is not. And we have some heuristics, definitions. You might think that, if a player brings dollars to the owner in the NFL, maybe he's valuable. If they contribute to winning, that's a different way to establish value. Maybe whatever, some people just define value based on what the free market would give you. Or often in sports we talk about, the value over replacement or the cost of replacing you on the field. All right. So in other sports, we have lots of different metrics people have had over the years. A lot of them have debuted here at various times. In baseball, we've had WAR for a long time, right? Trying to establish wins over replacement. We have things like win shares, win probability added. In basketball, ESPN does real plus minus. 538 just came out with a new metric this year called Raptor, which is similar. Win shares, expected possession value in basketball is on a per possession thing, but you could really roll that up if you wanted to over the course of a season. In hockey, we've had a regularized adjusted plus minus, which my boss, Brian McDonald, is known for. And these are all sorts of things that we've had been introduced here at Sloan over the years. But in football, we don't have this stuff. So we've had QBR at ESPN for about 10 years. We've had approximate value, which is really a good attempt to try to estimate the value of a football player with very limited resources. Recently, we've had the NFL Scraper package has a WAR for some skilled players, but they didn't have all the data. They just had play-by-play. So they came up with a framework to, hey, how do we estimate players? But they didn't actually have all the data to do it. And then PFF has recently come out with their own WAR based on their scouts grades. It's a little bit of a different framework of doing that than maybe what we do historically. But what we want to do at ESPN, what we have done is we have been able to estimate value in football for all players at a high level. I call it a course level. So I'm not looking at the minutia of every single play, whether or not you had your block or whether or not you didn't sustain your block or whether you did your assignment or didn't do your assignment. I want to just look at overall, did you bring value on the football field over the course of the season or the course of your career? And I want to make as little assumptions as possible, but solely rely on the data. I don't want to, we have lots of scouts and other ways to assess value, and we've had them for a long time based on, human evaluation. But I want to use as much data evaluation as I can, and we've come up with a way to do this. And it's similar to the plus-minus approaches we have in the past, but there are some key differences. So you might ask, well, why even do this, right? Because we have next-gen stats in the NFL. We're way beyond plus-minus. But the thing is, we kind of just skipped over this, right? In football, we haven't had a sort of single stat to evaluate players across all positions of the field. And we just kind of went straight from that to player tracking, right? And in basketball, we started out with box scores, and then we did adjusted plus minus, and then finally we got player tracking. And in football, we just went from passer rating to QBR to next-gen stats, which is like a gigantic leap all in one step. And we never had this sort of intermediate single stat to quantify people. And I think this is important because as we use next-gen stats in the NFL to quantify players, we can, if we have a singular number over the course of the season, that help us calibrate these intricate player tracking models as well. But in college, we don't have that, and we probably won't for a while. So we also can, my methodology can be used, and what we do here, we have it in college and in the NFL as well. You'll notice the typo, the NCCAF is supposed to be NCAAF. Thanks, I had to submit this a month ago and didn't catch this till 2 days ago. So plus-minus models work in other sports for various reasons, whether or not there's lots of substitutions or you play a lot of games, so you see every team play every other team, a lot of scoring plays, and these are all things that don't exist in football. So we did this in a way that's very different than what's been done in the past. So some of the ways we can handle this is instead of just looking at scores in football, similar to the hockey approach, we can look at expected outcomes. And on every play in football, there's about 70 offensive plays for each team in a game. So that's actually a lot of data. We have 140 outcomes in a football game, which makes it similar to basketball in that sense. And we don't have a lot of mixture of people on the football field, right? Like offensive linemen will play with offensive linemen, and they don't really sub out unless they're winning by a lot. You might see receivers go in and out with formations. The quarterback, if he's healthy, he's always out there, unless he's terrible. And in college, we have unbalanced schedules. Like you have 130 teams in college football, and you only play 12 of them in a regular season. It's like just under 10%, or just over 10%. Anyways, about around 10%, and that's a big problem, right? So I'm going to hopefully show you that what we have done is not too impacted by that. But we can use prior information I'm going to use a little subjective information as we can, but to help inform some of these things. All right, so other plus-minus approaches, this is like kind of what's been done in the past. So this is math for those of you that don't like math. I won't go too in-depth. Or the models. But we have linear model here, and we have a ridge regression, which is like the RAPM, real plus-minus type approach, which helps deal with this correlation that players are always on the field together, and it can parse some of that out. Typically we have okay, if someone's on the field, we give them a value of a 1 for the play, and then a -1 if they're on the other side of the field, and a 0 if they're not on the field. And then we can estimate what they call these betas, and that'll be the effect that the player has. So we can do this and from a Bayesian perspective, it's the same thing as just saying, okay, we have a prior distribution of mean 0, normal prior distribution, and a variance across players. And that ridge parameter that we see in the classical example is just the ratio of the variance in the model to the variance on the prior of the players. And so we think about it from this perspective. This will help explain sort of what we've done at ESPN. So we do this. Say I take the typical plus-minus approach and apply it to football. And so I have this ridge regression from a Bayesian perspective, but ridge regression, and I have an effect for home field and an effect for play type. So runs and passes, we know passes on average have a higher expected value and higher variance, so I'm going to count for that. And obviously, if you're on the home field, you're going to have a higher average play. If we apply this to the 2018 college football season, we get results such as this, with Kyler Murray #1, and then his 3 offensive linemen, 2, 3, and 4, which is exactly why no one does this in football up to this date. All right, this isn't very useful information. We all know that, no offense to Bobby Evans, but he wasn't in New York for the Heisman ceremony. It was his quarterback. And there's a reason for that. But a traditional plus-minus approach would not be able to tell that apart because they were on the field almost exactly all the same plays. About 98, 99% of all the plays, they were on the field together. And so we have to come up with a way, to separate that. And the key is, right, if you know football, and most of you probably know football pretty well, is that the quarterback is probably not the same importance as his offensive lineman. So even the best quarterback you'd probably rather have than the best offensive lineman. And we can take advantage of that. So we can tweak sort of this traditional approach and make it work in football. So the key is we have this parameter here, this SJ, which is really a different variance multiplication on the traditional variance depending on the position you're playing. And it works in such that if a position has high variance, it is more important. So if you can imagine, or has a bigger impact on the play. So if it's high variance position and you're at the best, that's going to be much better than if you're at a position where everyone's really closely related, and the replacement level is pretty close to what the actual level is of the top guy. And then we can use, instead of a mean 0, right? So what that does in ridge regression or other things, other plus minus models, is if you haven't played a lot, you're going to be assumed to be close to average. And we know that that's probably a bad assumption, that if you don't play a lot in sports, it's probably because you're not very good most of the time. So we're going to have a different thing that we're going to shrink these people towards. And this is different in college and in the NFL. To date, what we've done is we've used either, if you're a rookie, like your draft rank to estimate that value. In college, some recruiting data. Or if you're a second, third, fourth, whatever year player, we can use what we thought you were last year as your kind of starting point. I think this is the last math slide, so bear with me. So intuition would have it is that quarterbacks impact the game a lot more than other positions. But we can test this with this model, all right? And so some players play lots of positions, right? And I went to BYU. I'm a big Taysom Hill fan. He plays like 10 different positions. And so how do I really quantify him, right? I'm not going to pitch him as a quarterback when only a third of his plays are at quarterback. Well, I can take the linear weighted average, that SJ times is equal to it's a weighted average across phi, which is the parameter for positions. So I'm going to estimate this phi across all positions, and if someone plays lots of positions, I can take his weighted average based on his distribution across positions of that to kind of know his specific variance. And I can do this, and we use this t-distribution instead of a normal distribution, which is just a nice feature of doing Bayesian models where it has thick tails. And that's helpful because the best players are allowed to not be shrunk so closely towards average. If they really, truly are better, they're allowed to be even further out in the tails than the traditional plus-minus model would allow. And this is important because, I'll just say this. Like, we use 8 degrees of freedom. There's no magic in that number. It's just we have to run these things after a game, and some of these Bayesian models can be really slow. And so it's a good trade-off between efficiency and still having thick tails. All right, so I do this in a language called Stan, which is great for Bayesian models. And we run this, like in the NFL, we'll run this after every single, so after Thursday night, after Sunday night, and after Monday night, and have values by the next morning. In college, it takes a little bit for our data provider to track, because it's not, in next-gen we have next-gen stats, so we can know who's on the field in every play pretty instantaneously. And in college, we have manual tracking from a data provider, so that takes some time. But we still want to get this data as soon as possible as we can. I just gave some sample stand code. This isn't the exact stand code that I use, but it's kind of shows you, it helps you visualize the equations that I put on the board. All right, so here's some results. So in 2019, if we want to look at positional importance or really variance in college football, it should be no surprise that the quarterback is the furthest out, and by far the furthest out. So its distribution on the variance of a quarterback is much larger. And that shouldn't be a surprise. And I've shown this to several people, and a lot of you are probably wondering why the heck is a center the second next. And no one has ever on TV, in my experience, told me that the center is the next most important position in football to the quarterback. So it is somewhat of a surprising result, but I have actually showed this to several Division I coaches and staffs and other people. And typically, and one thing I like about this model and how we use this is it doesn't just capture stats that you would see on the field. Plus minus tries to capture things that are hard to measure, right? Just impact on the field. And most people I have talked to will say, well, the center is the one that calls our blocking schemes. And so whether or not the tackle held his block or not, if the center's assigning the tackle to the wrong spot, that might not show up on the tape, right? Because you don't know. But the data will show that when the center, who is good, gets replaced, it has a bigger impact on the outcome of his team than if the tackle, who gets replaced, has on the outcome of the team. And so most of these are really close together, and it could really depend on your team and your scheme and all these other sorts of variables. The tight end here, this is a tight end's like the least important position, but this is based on where they line up on the field. So when we say tight end here, it's hand in the dirt, end of the line, not someone standing up in the slot. That's actually, in our definition, classified as a slot wide receiver. As you'll see, those are considered fairly valuable. And people ask me, well, how sure can you be of this? So I do this every single year starting in 2007 in the NFL. We have a lot more data, and you can see these are the distributions that I just showed you, but on a different way to look at them across seasons. And you see this is pretty stable. There hasn't been any drastic changes in how we would estimate positional importance across time. Tight ends, inline tight ends have really not been that important since 2007. Quarterbacks have always been the most important, and there's some variation here. In the NFL, you'll notice there's a lot of uncertainty around running backs, and we always say running backs don't matter. And there's some truth to that, but at the same time, it's pretty uncertain. Maybe in some schemes they actually do matter, and others they don't. So just some results that we've been able to show in the last few seasons in this model in the NFL. The MVPs were the number one players in each season, Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. Last season, before everyone went crazy on Derrick Henry for his games in the playoffs, we thought he was a top 10 player in the NFL in terms of impact. And I don't think that should be too surprising after you can see what he did in the playoffs as well. One deficiency of our model I will point out is that if a quarterback is really good at passing, but his coach doesn't use him in that way, Russell Wilson, that he might not show up as high as he should. So in the future, we're actually going to, for next season, we're going to separate out the runs and the passes as separate models, and so that we don't hurt players. One thing we thought about is, this is similar on the other side to Aaron Donald. So Aaron Donald is typically considered the best defensive player in football. And against the pass, and all our pass rush win rates and things like that, he is so much better than everyone else. He's not even on the chart. But then against the run, he's not that great, right? Teams usually can run more effectively when he's on the field than when he's not. But the thing is, you'd rather force the team to run because running is not as efficient. So he has a lot of value in that way. And that's something that in the future, when we separate out these models, that we'll be able to show. In college, we had Kyler Murray number one in 18 and 2 last year. The model we've done is, like I said, the prior was based on the previous year's performance. So Joe Burrow, we didn't think he was good, but not great the year before, and so he had a hard time, even though he had a fantastic year last year. That prior did kind of prevent him from being number one last year. And we are going to change this, I think, in the future to use two different versions, a predictive version that uses previous year's results, and one in-season version that uses just numbers from that year to come up with a prior, similar to how we do ESPN's Real Plus Minus. All right, I'm just going to share a few plots to kind of validate some of our assumptions and some of our results. A lot of people will tell me, well, can you really, in that example, can you really tell apart a quarterback from his offensive line when they play together almost the whole time? And really we can. And you'll see in this chart, this average offensive lineman is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the quarterback's plus-minus value. And yes, they are correlated. You should expect that. You should expect some correlation if teams are good. Typically, they have good players across the board. But it's not as strong as you would think. And we can really see some teams that have strong lines and weak quarterbacks, and some teams that have strong quarterbacks and weak lines. Well, what about two offensive linemen that play together almost the whole time? So on the x-axis, I have offensive line with the most snaps, the offensive lineman with the most snaps, on the y-axis, the one with the second most snaps. Once again, they're correlated. You would expect that. But we are able to parse out. They're not perfectly correlated. There's some difference, and we can judge who should get more of the credit than the other. Well, what about transfers? This black line here is the perfect one-to-one correlation, just as a reference point. And you'll see that transfers have a steeper slope than that. So suggesting that in college football from 2018 to 19, that transfers typically were better in the new team than they were in the previous team. And that shouldn't be too surprising, right? This is another validation. You would expect that in college. As people get older, they get better, even if they're switching teams. In the NFL, when people switch teams, we notice the opposite trend. They typically get a little bit worse. So that trend line is below the one-to-one correlation. And that also shouldn't be too surprising, because in the NFL, after you're done with your first contract, you're getting a little bit older, closer to 30, and typically if a team doesn't want you, it's because you're not as good, and so you go to a new team. And this is all just to say that this is what we would expect. If I told you, what would you think? It's probably the conclusion you would have, and our model is able to bear that out. So the only thing that I've ever done in this model is I know their position, I know whether or not they're on the field, and I know down distance yard line for expected points. And that is really the only information that we're using, and we can parse out a lot of useful information using a framework that's been around for a while, but with some tweaks and modification for football. Some things that we've learned, though, is like in the future we're fixing, turnovers are random, so we're going to not just use expected points, but expected turnover EPA in the future. And like I said, we're going to have a predictive and a descriptive version because those are two different stories, right? We want to be able to tell who had the best 2019 season. We also want to tell, going into 2020, what a value of a trade or a free agent signing would be. And we can use all these things. We can come up with wins above replacement and all these other similar metrics using things like this. And like I also said, in this descriptive version, we're going to use box priors. This is similar to how we do real plus minus at ESPN, where we use box stats to have a good prior value on each player based on that season. I just gave some examples of that up here. All right, and I have some just high-level results if you want to just play around with a little bit of the data. I'm not giving all of it to you because I just can't. So, all right, questions? It's really hard for me to see, so over here,
yeah. Do you have any ideas like why there's such a discrepancy between how your model values centers and how they're seemingly valued in the NFL, like as far as like their average draft position?
Yes, I think the difference is that my model is coming up with more of a mental impact that they have and evaluating the blocking scheme, which doesn't show up on film necessarily because you don't know what the right call was. You don't know if the center even made the right call and if his lineman just didn't follow it or not. But in the data, we can see that when they get replaced and the backup comes in, they don't do as well.
Which is weird because that's something that you would think the coaches would have an edge over just a data-driven approach in taking into account.
Well, it's hard to see in college, right? Like to know. I mean, someone can correct me, but I would think that'd be a really hard thing to know for sure. Like just like with quarterbacks, right? It's hard to know what the coach told the quarterback where his first read was. And just like it's hard to know what the center was told to do in calling the blocking scheme. And whether or not the tackle held his block is something you can see on tape really well. But whether or not the center made the right call is a lot harder. Do I have anyone over here? Or all the questions over here? Right here. And yeah, you. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. His question was the center importance being continuity. And I mean, it is part of that for sure. I mean, I think my hypothesis, but at the same time, right, like when you replace the tackle or the guard or anyone else, you're not observing the same impact. And so whatever the reason is for that is a question to be studied, but it's different for the center than it is for other positions. Alok. I know his name, so I can do that.
Hey, Paul. Really nice work. My question was, do you think a version of this or a different version of this should include coach or coaches as well as the players? Because you could, in theory, see that they have some impact on the plays.
Yeah, I think we talked about this, like potentially, right? And maybe coaching and schemes or some sort of like personnel packages, seeing how people do in different schemes or personnel, and that might translate better to trying to evaluate whether, if I trade for someone or if I sign someone, if their impact from the one team will transfer to mine. I mean, that's definitely something to think about. Yeah, over here. One of you, it's hard to say. I see several hands. So mic people can choose.
Presumably there's a high correlation between a quarterback's rating according to your model and the team's success. So did you see a similar correlation between the center's rating and the team's success?
Yeah, but obviously not as strong. So our highest ranked center going into 2019 was Clemson's. And Trevor Lawrence was not the highest ranked quarterback. He was up there, but he wasn't the highest ranked quarterback going into 2019 for us. Way in the back. Or right here. I don't really care.
Do you think there's any reason that your model rated slot cornerbacks so much higher than just regular cornerbacks?
I'm sure there's a reason.
Okay.
I don't have the answer. No, sorry.
I noticed in your model there's a difference between outside linebackers and defensive ends for the NFL, but in the NFL there's 4-3 and 3-4, and players switch between all outside linebackers and defensive ends. Is there any way you account for like which player plays what position?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I kind of take the weighted average across the different positions that the person plays. So if they're lined up on the line as like an edge rusher, typically we'll just classify that as a defensive end for that play. And then if they're a few yards back as an outside linebacker. So those, like I said, those positions are really based on where they line up on the field. And if you line up on the field in several different spots, your values an average based on where you line up and this percentage of snaps you have across those different places on the field. I think we have time for one more. I see the cell phone, so yeah.
Yeah. So referring to the slide that you had that had all the different distribution charts,
Yeah.
and so it was like I suppose I should take that as the quarterback is most important, and then it follows like they're less important as you go on. So as I understand it, it's based on variance, right? So I would imagine the wider spread indicates more variance, but it didn't seem that the positions went in that order. Like there would be some that had less variance.
So those were posterior distributions on the variance. So you think like there was the variance of the variance was different, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
As those are distributions estimating the variance of each one.
Okay.
So some were more sure about how much variance there is than others. It's kind
Gotcha.
of like Inception.
Gotcha. And then really quickly, is there a reason why you only showed a distribution for college football? Did you have one for pro
In the
football?
NFL, I showed the vertical in a different format year over year, and it was a 90% interval vertical line. I forgot to mention that. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.